Imagine standing at the edge of a vast African savanna, roughly 100,000 years ago. The air is thick with heat. A small group of anatomically modern humans crouches around a fire, their eyes reflecting the flames. And then something happens that no creature on this planet has ever done before. One of them speaks. Not a grunt, not a warning cry, not the territorial bark of a threatened primate. A sound that carries meaning backward into memory and forward into imagination. A sound that tells a story. That single act, whenever it truly happened, however it truly began, changed life on Earth forever. Because in that moment, human beings became the only species that doesn't just survive the present. We remember the past. We imagine the future. We tell stories. And that changed everything. We are the only species on Earth that tells stories. We are the only creatures who argue about the past, dream about the future, and pass both down to strangers we will never meet. The evolution of language and the emergence of what scientists call behavioral modernity, that extraordinary flowering of symbolic thought. Art, ritual, and complex social organization that occurred somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, represents the most consequential transformation in the history of life on this planet. It is the moment our ancestors stopped merely surviving and began, in every meaningful sense, to become human. But here is what makes this story so remarkable and so maddeningly difficult to tell. It left almost no direct trace. Language does not fossilize. Words do not survive in rock. The conversations of our ancestors are gone forever, swallowed by a silence 100 millennia deep. What remains are fragments, a carved ochre stone here, a pierced shell there, the ghost of a gene buried in ancient DNA. And from these fragments, scientists, linguists, archaeologists, and anthropologists have spent centuries trying to reconstruct the greatest cognitive revolution in human history. The conditions that produced language did not arise overnight. Long before the first word was spoken, the stage was being set across millions of years of primate evolution. Our ancestors had already diverged from the lineage that would produce chimpanzees and bonobos, and over that vast span of time, the architecture of the human brain was quietly being rebuilt. The vocal tract was reshaping itself. The neural pathways connecting intention to sound were growing more complex. Even our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, possess latent symbolic capacities they rarely use in the wild. The raw materials for language were present in the primate mind long before language itself appeared. What was missing was the spark. Understanding how language actually works, how it could have emerged from pre-linguistic systems, requires us to think carefully about what language really is. It is not simply sound. It is not simply gesture. It is a system of arbitrary symbols, words, that carry meaning not because of any physical resemblance to what they represent, but purely through shared social agreement. A word like danger has no inherent connection to danger. It works only because every member of a community has agreed, implicitly, to treat it as meaningful. This is what linguists call the arbitrary nature of the sign, and it is profoundly strange when you stop to think about it. For arbitrary symbols to function at all, a society must maintain extraordinary levels of trust and accountability. If I tell you there is a predator behind the hill and there is not, my words are worse than useless, they are dangerous. Language, therefore, could only have become evolutionarily stable in a social environment already capable of enforcing honesty. Among the scholars who have wrestled most publicly with these questions, few names carry more weight than Noam Chomsky. A proponent of what researchers call discontinuity theory, Chomsky has argued that a single, dramatic change occurred in humans before they left Africa, coinciding with what he and others call the Great Leap, approximately 100,000 years ago. In his view, a common language faculty emerged in a group of humans and was passed down to all their descendants. His evidence is striking. Any human baby, from any culture, raised in a different culture, will completely assimilate that culture's language and behavior. No other species can do this. To Chomsky, this universality implies that no major change to the human language faculty has occurred since our ancestors departed Africa. Language, in this view, is something close to a biological endowment, a gift installed in us all at once, like a new organ switched on. But not everyone agrees. Michael Tomasolo and others who favor what are called continuity theories argue that language grew gradually from the cognitively controlled aspects of primate communication, and crucially, that gesture came before speech. In this view, our ancestors were signing before they were speaking, their hands and faces building the grammatical scaffolding that the voice would eventually inherit. Others imagine language evolving from early capacities for song, a musical proto-language of rhythm and melody that only later crystallized into discrete, meaningful words. These are not merely academic disputes. They are arguments about the deepest nature of what we are. The conflict runs deeper still. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, the entire question was considered too speculative for serious science. In 1866, the Linguistic Society of Paris took the extraordinary step of banning all existing and future debates on the origin of language, a prohibition that remained influential across the Western world for over a century. The topic was considered radioactive, too remote, too untestable, too prone to wild speculation. It was not until the early 1990s that academic interest genuinely returned, driven by new archaeological discoveries, advances in genetics, and the development of modern cognitive science. Decades of enforced silence had left a vacuum, and the rush to fill it has produced some of the most heated arguments in all of science. Consider what the archaeological record does preserve. Around 100,000 years ago, something begins to change in the material culture of early humans in Africa. At sites like Blombo's Cave in South Africa, researchers have found ochre pigments that were mined, processed, and almost certainly used for body painting, a behavior that implies not just aesthetics, but symbolic thought, the ability to represent identity and meaning through external marks on skin. Pierced shells appear, suggesting personal ornamentation. Geometric engravings are scratched into stone. These are not the behaviors of an animal, responding only to immediate sensory experience. These are the behaviors of a creature living simultaneously in the physical world and in a world of symbols, stories, and shared meaning. The gene FOXP2 offers another haunting window into this transformation. Found in the DNA of modern humans, this gene is associated with the fine motor control of the vocal tract and with aspects of language processing in the brain. When researchers have been able to recover DNA from extinct human relatives, the presence or absence of FOXP2 variants becomes a clue, imperfect, contested, but real, about who among our ancient relatives might have shared some capacity for speech. The biology of language is written into us, even if we cannot yet read it fully. And then there is Nicaraguan Sign Language, perhaps the most extraordinary natural experiment in the history of linguistics. In the late 20th century, deaf children in Nicaragua, brought together for the first time in schools, spontaneously created a new, fully structured sign language from scratch, with no adult model to imitate. Within a generation, the language had developed complex grammar. It had invented itself. This modern miracle offers a glimpse into what must have happened in some form deep in our prehistoric past, the moment when a community of minds, brought together under the right social conditions, generated language as if from nothing. What does all of this reveal about us? Perhaps this, that language is not merely a tool we use. It is the medium in which human consciousness itself exists. Without language, there is no remembered past, no imagined future, no shared myth, no law, no love letter, no lullaby. The emergence of language between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago was not simply a new behavior. It was the creation of a new kind of inner world, and with it, the creation of everything we have ever built, believed, or become. Today, linguists estimate that there are approximately 7,000 languages spoken on Earth, each one a unique architecture of thought, a different way of carving reality into meaning. And yet every one of them, from Mandarin to Swahili to Icelandic to the languages of the Amazon, shares the same deep structural logic, the same universal grammar that Chomsky identified as the signature of our common inheritance. We are all descendants of that first community of speakers, wherever and whenever they gathered. The future of this story is still being written. Artificial intelligence systems are now learning to process and generate human language with startling fluency, raising new questions about what language truly requires, whether meaning needs a mind behind it, or whether syntax alone is enough. Meanwhile, languages are vanishing at an accelerating rate, taking with them irreplaceable ways of knowing the world. And researchers are using ancient DNA, ever more powerful brain imaging, and the study of emerging sign languages to push deeper into the mystery of origins. We may never know the exact moment the first word was spoken, but we are getting closer to understanding what made it possible, and why, once it began, it changed our species forever. We are, at our core, the animal that speaks. And in that single fact lies the entire history of everything that makes us human.